Denise Krownbell. She works on salmon recovery in the Skagit and Tolt watersheds, from acquisition, restoration, and stewardship of salmon habitat lands to technical and policy work with various salmon recovery forums in Skagit and King County. Seattle City Light replanted portions of a conservation property in a climate-adapted manner, using trees sourced from the Seedlot selection tool and planning for modeled climate change conditions in 2050 and 2080. Trees were planted in February, March of last year, 2020, and she'll present the first year survival rates and growth data for each species, included the assisted migration species. So with that, assisted migration planting data from year 1. Denise, take it away.
Thanks, Emily, for the introduction. And thanks everybody for the previous speakers and for the invitation to speak here today. So Seattle City Light is the city's public electric company. And I run the ESA Endangered Species Act lands program, and that is to acquire habitat for endangered or threatened species and protect it in perpetuity, and that does involve restoration. And I also need to put a disclaimer out there. I'm a fish biologist. I am not a plant person. I've learned a lot through this project and still learning, but if I get something wrong, feel free to say, hey, that wasn't quite right. So just want to point out our partners for this. We got this whole project was made possible with a grant from the Climate Adaptation Fund of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And that was made possible with a donation from the Doris Duke Charitable Foundation. And the point of this grant was to do exactly this, adaptive management, using the Seedlot selection tool and then communicating that information. Seattle City Light and the City of Seattle is not a research organization, so we want to share this information. So our partners, Mountains to Sound, Greenway Trust, Northwest Natural Resource Group, and then the water side of the utility at Seattle is Seattle Public Utilities, and they were also one of our partners. So just a little background about the site. It's a 154-acre site in the temperate forest zone of the Cascade Mountain foothills in Western Washington, so the Mid-Sound region of Puget Sound. Stocked with second growth Douglas fir when it was harvested in 2012, and it's surrounded by predominantly Douglas fir forests in public ownership. Then City Light purchased it in 2015 as part of the ESA program, and looking specifically for this property, looking at steelhead benefits for the property. And there's over 3,500 feet of Stossel Creek that runs through the site, plus an unnamed tributary, about 1,300 feet of that running through the site. So this is an overview of the site. The lower inset map shows that the site is located about 30 miles east of Seattle. And the upper inset map shows Stossel Creek coming in from the north into the Tolt River below the confluence of the North and South Fork Tolt River. And this is in King County in Washington. And what you can see, Stossel Creek runs through the western side of the property. The lower, on the lower eastern side comes in the unnamed creek. There's a road, Stossel Creek Way, that is across the lower portion of the property, and then an abandoned road that you can still see through this aerial in the middle of this property. And just, it's hard to see on this map, but there are a lot of microclimates on this site with the elevation gain. And between a lower high spot and a higher spot in the upper portion of the property in the north side or the northern portion, there is running east to west through the property is valley. So we definitely have some microclimates on the site, which we were taking advantage of. Thank you so much for our previous speakers really setting this all up for why we were looking at planning this in a climate adaptive way. So just real quick for Western Washington, annual temperature, and I'm, in general in Western Washington, looking at 4 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century and an additional 1 to 4 degrees above that by the end of the century. Summer temperatures are expected to warm more than the annual average, 4 to 5 degrees potentially by mid-century. And then regional projections are what you heard earlier, that we're going to see an increase of winter precipitation as rain as opposed to snow, and obviously resulting in a lower snowpack and earlier spring melt. And then certainly this past month is a very good indication of increasing intensity of precipitation events in the fall and spring months. And certainly, I don't know about you, our basement saw a lot of water this year, way more than, we haven't had water in our basement in years. So we're definitely seeing changes. And then just the projected result being warmer temperatures and less summer precipitation will cause drought stress for native trees that are adapted to colder temperatures and wetter conditions in the spring and summer, in particular Douglas fir. So our project goals and objectives. So the overall goal was to get a mature, ultimately 80 years and older forest that provides critical ecosystem functions in the next century. And we're talking both wildlife and fish, not just fish habitat, but also wildlife. And, without the need for future intervention. DNR and King County have had plans over the years to remove the road, to abandon the road that's in the lower portion of the property and just open it up when there's need for timber harvest. So because there is sediment input into the property or into Stossel Creek and some of the creeks in the area leading into the Tolt because of this road. So there's a potential that we will have long stretches where we wouldn't be able to access the property anyway. So we want to make sure that it's a fully functional ecosystem. And then our objective was to do just this, test the assisted migration of the tree genotypes with alternative seed sources for 2 native species, both Doug fir and western red cedar, to see if moving seed sources from a warmer to a cooler climates is an option for adapting forests to climate change. And as you'll hear, we had to add incense cedar later due to sourcing issues. And also as part of the grant, one of the objectives was to give a workshop, which you'll hear about later, but was a total, as we said, we want to share information. It was just a great opportunity to do that. Again, just like in this forum. So our methods, thank you, Dominique, for setting up the Seedlot selection tool discussion. And as you saw, there were some maps about Stossel Creek on there. So we're using Douglas fir and western red cedar sources from the southern Willamette Valley and the Coast Range of Oregon and Northern California. And again, that came out from the Seedlot selection tool model, projecting out 20 to 30 years. And the later century adapted seed sources, the model indicated, should be sourced from the southern Oregon Coast Range or Northern California. And I do want to say that this work was done by Crystal Raymond, who used to be at Seattle City Light, and she's now at the Climate Impacts Group at University of Washington, and Rolf Gersund, who's at SPU, Seattle Public Utilities. And they did a bunch of the work with folks from the Forest Service. So I am not the Seedlot selection tool expert at all. So kudos to them for running that. And so what it came up with was, and what we were able to source was from Western Washington. We had western red cedar, Doug fir, the grand fir, shore pine, western white pine, and Gary oak. And then from Northern Oregon coast, we had western red cedar and Doug fir. And then Northern California, Doug fir, and we wanted western red cedar, but we were not able to get it. So that we chose incense cedar. And that was one of the other ways we had some assisted migration. Just to wrap up or kind of highlight the assisted migration, we essentially have 2 types: within population assisted migration, so moving genotypes within the species range, which we did for the western red cedar and Doug fir. And then incense cedar is the one that's outside of its range. And I appreciate the information and wish we had had some more insight. We did know when we chose incense cedar that this was definitely a riskier situation, but it was a choice that we made because it is adapted to warmer and drier climates as the California red cedar is. So we were like, okay, that's our best analog. That's what we're going to go with. So different species, but zones overlap. And as I said, it's more adapted to in its own range to warmer and drier conditions. And just to, give other examples, in the case of Gary oak, their range is up to Vancouver Island. And as they grow in the rain shadow, much like Doug fir. So the use of Gary oak is an example of using a closer, smaller scale adaptation. And just want to reiterate, to state that drier is relative. When you talk about, it's drier conditions and you're talking about the east side, that has different connotations than exposed and adapted to drier conditions on the west side, whether it's a rain shadow adaptation. All the things that went into preparing for planting, there was a property-wide plant inventory in 2017, and Rolf did that, as well as Sally Nicholson, also of Seattle Public Utilities. And then there was ground preparation. We did invasive treatment seasonally in 2018, 19, and 2020. And we know we will need to do some more invasive treatments throughout the property during this project. Cultural survey was completed to make sure that we could safely do our plantings without disturbing any cultural resources. The property was divided into planting zones from the plant inventory, and I'll show that a little more on the next slide. And then trees were planted throughout the property in groups of 25. And I do believe in Dan's talk or David's talk earlier this morning, he spoke about doing it in groups. So it was groups of 25 with 8 by 8 foot spacing, 3 foot diameter circles that were cleared of vegetation and shallow roots. Because as you'll see in some of the photos, we definitely have, there was regeneration on site, and we were not trying to revegetate the entire property. We wanted to build on what was there and add some diversity and add some climate adaptability within, build that into the project. So all the red cedars and Gary oak and most of the shore pine had Vexar tubing. And then we had monitoring plots that were entirely cleared of vegetation and a 2 foot diameter circle of shallow roots. This map shows the zones that the property was broken up into, and I do have a breakout of the actual planting, so if that's hard to see. But there are some wetland areas on site, and that's shown on the northeastern portion in zone 6 and 7. And as folks have probably already noticed, the orange abandoned road, shocking, we have a bunch of invasive species along the road, and also along the road in the lower portion of the property. There is one spot that is off of that, but again, most of our invasives were limited strictly to the roads on the property. So this is just a blow up of showing what we were planting in each of the areas. So some areas, as I said, when the planting inventory demonstrated that, hey, there's enough, natural re-veg going on here. We don't need to do any more planting. So there are some areas we completely left alone. And additionally, it would be very hard for us to, certainly my program would have a hard time supporting fully replanting 154 acres. And that was not our intent. So, and then showing here some of the other, in the zones where we were planting them. And the zones essentially were determined by the species that were already growing there and that had regenerated, the soil type, and the microclimate that was found there. So our monitoring plots, we did have 6 trial plots, 2 blocks of 3 units, and to represent the 2 dominant soil types. So the gravelly sandy loam, glacial drift, and gravelly medial loam, glacial till. And the plots were all planted with the 10 seed sources that we had in randomly assigned rows of 15 plants. Each seedling was flagged, tagged, and protected from browse with Vexar tubing. And the tags include labels for the planting unit or the area and the zone, the block, the row, and the seedling number. And I have to say, for the monitoring plots, this work is being done by Mountains to Sound Greenway Trust. And they've been a great partner in this. And Dan Heights in particular has done a lot of work trying to make sure this monitoring was set up correctly and set up to, give us some, what we're hoping is meaningful information when all this is done. So kudos to Dan. So this is just showing what one of those plots, this is a three of the units. So showing what our monitoring plots look like. So the randomly assigned species, each in rows of 15. And these monitoring blocks were 90 feet by 130 feet. And the only difference here was that we wound up with 3 foot high Vexar tubing put on the plants, not 4 foot high. So monitoring data that was collected was, are the trees alive or dead? And if they're dead, are they in place or are they missing? Vigor, which was determined by percent leaf, live leaf tissue, which had 4 different rankings. Damage or browse, which was percent damage with 4 rankings. And I do want to say here that we expected to have browse on the site. And so we are not testing for browse. So that was why we were really trying to test for climate adaptability. And so that's why we put tubing on everything in the planting trial. Bud break, so percent buds broken with 3 different rankings, the height in centimeters to the tip of the terminal bud or the branch tip. And then we also did photo monitoring points, 6 in the trial plots, 6 out in different spots in the property. from 4 cardinal directions at 6 meters to the centered T-post. And currently we are planning to monitor for 5 years, twice a year, and we'll reevaluate our monitoring after 5 years. So results, this is after 7 months. So trees were planted in February and March, and the data was collected in September. So this slide represents a combination of all the monitoring plots and that data together. So we saw an overall average survival rate of 86%, and average vigor of 2.6. And from the combined results, you can see that Doug fir from California and Oregon had the highest survival rate, while Western red cedar from Oregon and Washington had the lowest survival and the lowest vigor. And incense cedar, I'm just pointing it out since I know is it of interest, was essentially in the middle of these. So in this, it's just breaking out block 1 and block 2 because we did see differences between block 1 and block 2, and the biggest one being survivorship. So total survival in the block 1 units was 92% and block 2 was 80%. So just getting into the details of block 1. So, and there's another slide with unit 3 of block 1. But looking at this, at the details, you can see the variability between the plots. If you look at Western white pine, in block 1, unit 1, it has 100% survival rate, but a 2% vigor. And again, vigor was on a scale of 4. And then Western white pine in block 1, unit 2 had 86% survival rate and a vigor of 1.87. So in particular, obviously stating that it's 100% survival rate doesn't necessarily mean that it's growing well. So this is block 1 continued. Oh, and I guess the other thing I wanted to state was that Western red cedars from Oregon and Washington had a survival rate of 93 to 73% and vigor from 2.9 to 2.45. So just picking out some things to point out here. So this is a photo monitoring of block 1, unit 2. The first picture looking into the site from the north, and the second picture looking into the site from the east. And as you can see, there's plenty of plant material outside of the monitoring plots, and there's plant material inside the monitoring plots outside of what we planted. So, and again, these were taken in mid-September, so you can see the regeneration at the site, and there is definitely some native competition. So getting into block 2 details, you can see a total drop off in survival rate of Western red cedars, and this is, this was the biggest driver of that difference between the block 1 and block 2 survivability numbers. So 46% in unit 1 to 26% in unit 2. And you still see good survival rates, even 100% for the Gary oaks. And some of the Doug firs with the Gary oak vigor was strong at 3.5 to 4. So those were growing well. And Doug firs ranging from 3.6 to 2.8. Again, this is block 2, unit 3. And here seeing different numbers in the survival rate. So these will be the photo monitoring points. So this is where we were wondering if we were getting some competition from, whether it's shading or what effect we were having from the plants outside of the monitoring blocks. Because obviously these are much larger than and closer to the monitoring blocks than what we saw with block 1 or the block 1 units. And then to show some photo monitoring points from outside of the monitoring blocks, but just in sites around the property. This first one being zone 16, looking from the west into the property or into the unit. And then the other one in zone 18 and just looking in from the south. And again, so folks can see what kind of regeneration was already on the site. And again, just as a reminder, the property was harvested in 2012. Overall, just our observations, competition with native vegetation likely impacted the block results. And since then, in September, the Mountains to Sound crews went and cleared a 3-foot wide circle around all the plants in the monitoring blocks instead of a 2-foot wide circle. And preferably that, in hindsight, obviously that would have been better to have happened in March with the plantings, but so it goes. Height measurements were certainly harder with the Vexar on, particularly with the Gary oak. And so that might have impacted some of our readings for the Gary oak. Western red cedar from Washington and Oregon had the lowest survival and vigor. And the Doug fir from Oregon and California had the highest survival rates. And I don't know if folks remember with the initial, when Washington shut down for COVID, so towards the end of March. And I don't know if you were like me, I was doing a lot of walking around my neighborhood and people were like, oh, the weather's great, you know, through the end of March and into April and how awesome it was. And I was like, yeah, this is great. And in the back of my mind, I'm like, yeah, those trees are getting no water. So anyway, that's why we're doing all this. So the Gary Oaks had the highest vigor rates. And again, we're not certain why Block 2 had lower survival rates, but maybe it's soil type since it is a different soil. Maybe it was the exposure. So one of the options that we're looking at is some moisture probes. And we're also looking, and I know Dominique was talking about this in her talk about getting more, you know, essentially weather information about the site. So we're looking at on-site temperature readings and have it again scattered for all these scattered throughout the property since there are so many microclimates on site. So I wanted to give a shout out about our workshop. This is Rolf talking to one of the groups, but this is at the workshop on March 3rd. And Northwest Natural Resource Group and Rowan Braybrook, she was awesome, rock star for getting this workshop set up. We had 35 restoration practitioners and small forest landowners that participated in the workshop. And, you know, hopefully, like I believe Brenda was saying, you know, from this group meeting today, there'll be a listserv and a communication. So we have that set up with this group of folks that attended the workshop. So just overall, just some quick lessons learned, especially for any site, obviously, but for a site as large as 154 acres with Stossel, even though we weren't going to be planting the whole property, we were planting in different areas, start the cultural survey early and have it be, you know, just start off your process that way once you know exactly what you're doing. And then the other thing to start early is your seed source or getting, you know, your seedlings. We contacted nurseries early and some of them were like, you want what? You know, no, we don't do that. Some did, and some were able to work with their networks of nurseries to get us some material or put us in touch with other nurseries. But, and, you know, again, this is changing because some of them were like, yeah, we keep getting more requests for like Oregon red cedar or, you know, so it's not as unusual, but it was still difficult. And that was what forced us to change from California red cedar to use the incense cedar. So start early with that, earlier than you'd think. And then ideally, you know, the ideal situation would be to get the seed source. And this, I guess, with Deborah's presentation, no, we don't know, like from the plants that we got, we don't know their genetics. We do have the information of where, you know, what nursery we got it from and the information they have, but certainly not the detailed workup that Deborah was talking about. So anyway, but obviously the more information you have, the more you can control what you're getting. So if you get the seed source and grow it locally yourself before you plant it, that would obviously give you more certainty in your seed source and seed information. Here I want to show, because I want to give another shout out to Dan Heinz. That's him in the middle leading another discussion at one of our monitoring sites at the Stossel Creek site. And with that, I can take questions.
Is there any statistical analysis to isolate variables, or is that coming still? I know you're just in your first year of monitoring.
Yes, we're going to be trying to get as much information out from everything that we've done. So no, that information is not currently available. And if that's something that we can parse out from how it's gathered, I don't know offhand, but again, we're trying to, you know, bring forth as much information with data behind it as possible, hence at least the 5 years of monitoring. So